If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome everyone at our next installment in a wartime lecture series in which we reflect on the ongoing war that started, the hot phase that started with a full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine on 24th of February. And in this series, before we mainly reflected on philosophical and political matters, and today we will talk more about economic issues. If I may remind, I'm Anna Osipchuk. I'm research director at School for Policy Analysis of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which together with Kyiv-Mohyla Alumni Association and the university itself is the organizer of this series, and we are very thankful to the Justus Liebig University of Gießen for the generous support they provided for this series and their help in organizing this series of lecture. And today I'm very happy to welcome Юрій Городніченко, who is also an alumni of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and who is also currently a professor of economics in the University of California, Berkeley. Yuri, we are very happy to have you today, and I'm also very happy to know I'm just currently that Alexandra Humenna also joined us today as commentator, and Alexandra Humenna is a professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. So we have today a Kyiv-Mohyla gathering here, probably the first one in all this period of lectures. Yeah, so without further remarks and comments from me, I will pass the word to Yuri. And if I just may remind to everyone watching us that please post your comments and questions in a comment section to the live broadcast. So please, Yuri.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Let me start sharing my slides, please. Okay, thank you. The title of my lecture today is Wartime Economy, and I have two objectives here. One is to give a short overview of how various economies operated in war times, and kind of draw some lessons for Ukraine. And the second one is to focus more specifically on Ukraine and say a few words about what is right, what is not right, what could be done, what should be done. So the objective is two things: provide historical overview and to draw some lessons for Ukraine. Let me start with the principles of wartime economy. What kind of things typically happen in a war? Well, obviously, any kind of war is a concentration of resources and effort for a country. And this means that you have to mobilize resources in every possible way. One prominent example of how this worked, for example, during World War II, was that women became much more involved in labor force. So while men were fighting at the front lines, women were producing munitions and taking care of children, and filling in basically jobs that were left behind by the men. Now, this is not just about mobilizing women. It's lots and lots of things. You try to utilize idle capacity as much as possible. You try to squeeze out the maximum from the available resources. One way also how we can see this is to see how much of the economy is concentrated on producing military equipment, munitions, tanks, paying salaries to soldiers, officers, and so on. And this table here shows how the share of GDP that was dedicated to military outlays across different countries. And so here what you should see is that in 1939, some countries committed, Germany, Japan, UK, roughly 15-20% of their GDP to military spending. This was already very high. But as the war was progressing, World War II, we see that the share has increased to something like 50%. And that's a huge number, a huge number. Now, Ukraine is not there yet in the sense that the government is spending roughly 20% of GDP on security, which is very significant. It's a very big number. But we should also keep in mind that we get a lot of resources from our allies, probably another 20% of GDP in terms of military equipment. So when you add this up, we're kind of approaching to the statistics we have seen during World War II for countries that were at war, right? Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, USA. And so this is telling us that we should be thinking about World War II as potentially a useful example about how we should respond to economic challenges. Another thing which is typical in wars is that you have to have, in terms of economies, mass production. It has two objectives. One is you have to have standardized military equipment. So if your tank is taken out, you can still recycle parts of this tank for another tank that may be fighting in the battles. That's kind of interchangeability that is critical in the battlefield. But it is also important in terms of economics, because if you have standardized parts, it's much easier to organize production cheaply, right? So it's much easier to produce this military equipment at lower prices. Now, Ukraine does not really produce a ton of military equipment, not at the scale we've seen in the US or the UK during World War II, but still we kind of get into the stage when we start to produce more and more military equipment. And so we have to keep in mind that in this arena, we have to focus on standardization, make sure that everybody is producing more or less the same thing, because this is how we can achieve economies of scale. Another key principle of the war economy is centralization. And again, if you look at the World War II, the way it was organized is different from peace economy. For example, the Roosevelt administration set up a war production board. So it's almost like a central planning agency, like Gosplan in the Soviet Union, where you try to allocate resources not by the direction of the market, but by direction of the government. It has pluses and minuses. During World War II, the main challenges in terms of war production were where you get workforce, where you get raw materials. And raw materials were particularly a challenging issue, where you get rubber, for example, where you get tin, where you get aluminum, and so on. Now, Ukraine doesn't have these issues directly because, as I said before, we don't really produce military equipment, so we don't need to come up with, rubber or tin or lead or anything like this to produce military equipment. However, we should keep in mind that some raw materials are going to be a problem in Ukraine. And one area where we can see this very clearly is shortages of electricity. We have these blackouts, and the government is basically deciding who is going to get electricity and who is not going to get electricity. Now, this is not to say that you have to use government to direct resources always and everywhere. If I had, for example, smart meters, there should have been a way in Ukraine to allocate electricity to more productive users using market forces. So, for example, you say, your tariff for electricity is going to be a function of how much capacity you have in the grid. And if somebody is desperate to get electricity, he or she can pay this high price. If we have somebody who can reserve, save electricity, postpone usage, then these people can pay a lower tariff. Unfortunately, our infrastructure does not allow us to do something like this. And so some government direction may be useful here. But as a general principle, to this day, there is a debate about whether this kind of coordination of resources was necessarily helping the economy, right? So, for example, one thing you can see very clearly from the history of this board is that there was inflation of priorities. You started with, priority A, B, C, D, where A is the highest priority, and then everybody was claiming, okay, I'm priority A, I should have resources. And so then this board had to come up with kind of refinements of group A. It would be A1, A2, A3, A4. And again, at some point, everybody was claiming their A1 priority. So everybody was claiming they're the highest priority to get these resources. So it's not clear that, this is really sustainable in the long run, but this is what people have done in the past. Now, another related thing is that the government was taking control over more and more areas of economic life. And, one visible part of this was the control of prices. This table here shows you what kind of things were regulated. And you can see it's prices for sugar, coffee, shoes, even typewriters. I was always wondering, why would you regulate prices of typewriters? But at the time, this was like computers, right? So if you want to submit an order for something, it has to be typewritten, typed on a typewriter. Kind of an unusual item, but it kind of makes sense when you think about what constraints they faced at the time. Now, one issue with this approach is that over time, more and more goods are going to be regulated. You can see that it started with basic things like processed food and sugar, but eventually it got even into kind of finished products like shoes. In February 1943, they switched to other items. So this is telling us that over time, the government, if it takes this route, is going to regulate more and more prices. And that's not necessarily a good thing because it creates more and more distortions in the economy, more and more shortages. The black market is the infamous example of those problems. Now, one rationale for using price regulation was we want to control prices, and we can debate about whether this is the way to do this. It's really treating symptoms of other things that happen in the economy, which I'm going to discuss in a bit. Another rationale for this was, well, we want to make sure that everybody is going to have access to sugar, coffee, processed food, and so on. And this was an argument basically saying that we want to have price regulation for equity reasons, right? So the war is affecting everybody. We want to make sure that everybody has food, shoes, bicycles or gasoline. Now, this was at the time when technology was still very limited. And so the best the governments could do is to issue ration cards. Right? So you have like a coupon that you can take to a store and say, I can buy sugar with this, or I can buy coffee with this. Now, with the modern technology, you can make this support of the population much more targeted. Only the most needed people will have access to subsidized prices or have incomes transfers that are going to allow them to buy these goods. So the general point I want to make here is that at the time this was the best technology if you want to feed people and make sure that everybody has access to basic goods and services like bread, milk, coffee, and so on. But now we have much better technologies, and so we can make this government support much more targeted. Now, how do you pay for the war? Okay, so the wars are extremely expensive. If you commit 30-40% of your GDP to the war, somebody has to pay for it. And we have several basic mechanisms to do this. One is the government is going to issue debt. And in many ways, I'll talk about this in a moment, this is the best way to pay for the war because it creates the smallest distortions. Now, how you can borrow? Okay, so one thing you can do is obviously borrow from other countries, but that's not going to be an option for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot borrow in the international capital markets. You can borrow internally, domestically. Okay, so somebody has to lend you money, maybe banks, maybe firms, maybe households. And the general idea is that you should try to borrow from the general population as much as possible for a variety of reasons, which I'll describe in a moment. Now, in the US, the solution to this was to issue what is called Bond Series E. I have an example here on the slide. And anybody could buy this bond. You can buy it in a post office, you can buy it in a bank, you can automatically deduct from your paycheck and buy these bonds. And so access to this was really, really broad. And we have something like this. You can buy government bonds in Dia City, for example. I'm sorry, in Dia government app. But it's not as popularized as it was done in the US. In the US, it was really like an industry, basically. Lots of Hollywood stars and other celebrities were advertising government bonds, and it was extremely popular. Tens of millions of people lent money to the government. Another thing you can do to pay for the war is to raise taxes. Right, so somebody has to pay workers to produce munitions, tanks, and so on. This figure here shows the tax rate for the top income bracket in the U.S. Right, so you have scales, and in certain income brackets, the top income bracket, this is going to be your tax rate. And what you should see here is the following: when the personal income tax was introduced in the U.S., this was before World War I, 1913. It was very small, less than 10%. During World War I, the highest tax rate that applied to the highest incomes was close to 80%. So it was extremely progressive. When the war was over, World War I, the tax rate fell to less than 30%. During World War II, you see there was a massive increase in the tax rate, and it was more than 90%. Okay, so the idea was we want to raise more revenue. We have to make tax rates more progressive because this is where people have the highest, the largest resources, and so for them, taking away their income is going to be less painful. Now, when the war was over time, the tax rate was reduced. Okay. Now, this is personal income tax rate. And so what I want you to get from this is that during wars, taxes become more progressive and tax rates get really, really high. Now, this is not just personal income. You can also look at corporate tax rate. So think about this as taxes on profits of corporations, the business sector. And what you should see here is that, when this tax was introduced, it was very, very small. Right, so if you look to 1900s, early 1900s, it was very, very low. Then you have First World War. This is the first time you have a major increase in the tax rate. You basically go from 0 to 10%. Then when you go into World War II, you have another major increase in the tax rates. You go to 40%. Okay. Then when you have the Korean War, you go to over 50%. Okay. So this is telling us that, again, you try to raise revenue from a variety of sources. Many businesses are going to make huge profits because they produce a lot of stuff for the government, like tanks, planes, munitions, and so on. And they make huge profits. And part of the reason why these taxes were introduced was to control for excessive profits. Okay, try to extract resources from that. Now, as a point of reference, the corporate income tax rate in Ukraine is now 18%. So this is way, way below what was the rate in the US during World War II. Also, if we go here to the personal income tax rate, we know we have a flat personal income tax rate in Ukraine, 18%, plus we have an extra military surcharge, 1.5%. So in any case, it's roughly 20%. This is way, way, way below what was done in World War II in the US. Okay, so big differences. Another thing which was striking during the wars was that the number of people who were paying taxes increased dramatically. So basically you broaden the tax base as much as possible. And you can see this happening in World War I, right? So this is the first bump in this figure. And then there was a massive increase during World War II, massive increase. How do you do this? Well, you say we'll have fewer deductions. We're going to broaden the tax base in terms of closing loopholes, so you can't claim certain types of income as tax-free. You have to pay taxes on this. And again, all of this was directed to raising more revenue to pay for the war economy. Okay. Another thing I wanted to mention here briefly that you can do is to try to cut spending, non-military spending. Now, it's easier to say than to do. We know that government spending during wars is really determined by what is happening in battlefields. And so for the government, it's very hard to control government spending. But some types of spending may be a little easier to reduce or control. For example, one standard sort of prescription in this line of thinking is that if you have development budgets, you should try to cut them to the bare minimum. So think about this as roads, very popular topic in Ukraine. If you have a regular maintenance of a road, you should not do this during the war, because you commit resources to something that may be postponed a little bit without much damage. Kind of the thinking is you can repair your road in May or June. In the big scheme of things, it's not going to make a huge difference. So you should do this in June. But if you can push it to August, you should push it to August. If you can push it to the next year, you should push it to the next year. And we already see that the Ukrainian government is starting to do this. They cut development budgets. They unfortunately also cut effectively spending on education and on science. But in a way, this is a form of borrowing. You say, okay, I'm going to make up for all this reduced spending now with above average spending in the future. So is the promise, so is the plan. Another thing you can do is to get aid from the allies. And this figure here shows how much aid was transferred to the allies of the United States during World War II. Right? So specifically to the Soviet Union. We had shipments through the Pacific route. You also had through the North Atlantic and other areas. And it was very, very significant amounts, very significant amounts. So you have to choose your allies wisely. And this is the most important support now for Ukraine, obviously. The final source of revenue is printed money, seigniorage, right? So the government has the monopoly of printing money. And when you print money, you create what is called the inflation tax. So basically you tax people who hold cash. And it has pluses and minuses. The plus side is that you can mobilize resources very, very quickly. And we saw that something like this was done by the Ukrainian government in the early days of the war, when the National Bank of Ukraine was effectively printing a lot of money to pay for military expenditure, for refugees, for lots and lots of things. The downside of this approach is that if you keep doing this, you're going to accelerate inflation. And if you want to raise more money through this channel, you have to keep inflation accelerating. Okay, so it's ever increasing inflation rate. And at some point, you're going to have a hyperinflation, which we know is going to be very, very destructive for the economy. Very destructive for the economy. Now, Ukraine unfortunately relies a lot on seigniorage, and this is one area where you have to really stop printing money and re-optimize funding of the war. And just to give you a sense of how dangerous this can be, I'll show you some figures. And some of them are saying that printing money during wars is not unusual. This happens all the time. But we should also understand that if you just rely on money, printing money as a source of funding your war effort, you're going to end up with a lot of inflation. My first example is the independence war for the United States. Okay, so in some ways, the US is similar to Ukraine. We also have an independence war. And they printed a lot of money, a lot of money. And so by the end of the war, the dollar was worth only 1/100th of its original value. Okay, so cumulatively inflation increased the level of prices by a factor of 100. Okay, and only at some point they started to back their currency with gold and silver, and this was how they stopped inflation. But this is just telling you that if you don't have resources to pay for your work, you can generate a lot of inflation. Another example, this is Confederates, the South during the Civil War. They didn't have industrial base. They had to print a lot of money to pay for the war. You can see that the level of prices increased by a factor of almost 10,000. Okay, so again, this is clearly not sustainable. We know South lost in this war, and in part why it lost is because they didn't have strong economic support for their war effort. Germany after World War I. Okay, so that's a famous example where the Allies imposed reparations on Germany after World War I. They didn't have resources, the economy to pay for this, and so they relied on printing money, and the rate of inflation was astronomical. Right? So you can see that newspaper was going from 0.3 marks per newspaper to over 70 million. Okay, a huge rate of inflation. We also saw this in Ukraine, and it's more general than the war. Whenever the tax system is not able to generate enough revenue to pay for government spending, it is very tempting for governments to start printing money. And we lived through this in the early 90s. We know that hyperinflation is extremely destructive. It creates all sorts of crazy redistributions, perverse incentives, and it's very, very damaging for the economy. So we know we should avoid this as much as possible, because it's going to really affect our ability to support the war effort. Now, having said this, I want to also emphasize that every time we have a war, there is some inflation, because the governments almost invariably rely on printing money. There are only a few instances when this didn't happen. But historically, for example, you look at even the countries that had a good track record, like the US, and every time you had a war, there was inflation. This is Napoleonic Wars, you have Civil War, World War I, World War II. So every time you had a war, there was a lot of inflation. And by the way, so this was happening during gold standard times. So this is why you have an increase in the level of prices, but then it's followed by a long period of deflation to bring the level of prices to parity. This has pluses and minuses. I don't have time to discuss this, but we're not going to see anything like this in more recent times, right? So this reversals when you go from a peak of level of prices to a lower level. We're not going to see this anywhere in modern economies. In more recent times, again, you don't have a ton of inflation in the US, but we have some instances when inflation spiked because of the war. For example, the first spike in this figure, this is immediately after World War II, when prices were liberalized in the US. And you can see that within a year or two, inflation spiked at 20%. So even in countries like the US, you can have a lot of inflation. It didn't happen during the war. It was postponed until the end of the war. But still, it was a big inflation spike. The second spike is the Korean War. It was much smaller, and it happened for reasons which I'm going to discuss in a moment. But the main point here is that the Korean War relied a lot less on printing money. It was still a very strong demand shock, which created overheating in the economy, and this is what generated inflation. Now, the third episode, late 1960s expansion, this is Vietnam War. This is the time when monetary policy was very expansionary, fiscal policy was very expansionary. And so this is the time when inflation crept up and stayed high for a long time. And then when we had oil price shock, it generated the great inflation. Now, when we move forward and look at episodes 5 and 6, 6 was not really a war. This was something else. But episode 5 was in part related to wars. It was the invasion of Kuwait. And the reason why inflation spiked then was mainly because we had high energy prices. It wasn't because of some internal problems in the economy. In any case, what I want to convey here is that it is not unusual that the governments are printing money. So this happens. The only time when in recent history in the US, when the government did not print money to pay for the war, was the Korean War. all of that was funded by increased taxes. This is why also the increase in the level of prices here, the second episode, was not as high as we saw in other wars. Okay, it was very moderate. But generally, printing money is a common sense. What we want to avoid is this uncontrolled seigniorage, when we almost exclusively rely on printing money to pay for the war, because that sin is going to end up in a disaster. Now, so this is what people have been doing. This is what countries have been doing during wars. It doesn't mean this is the optimal thing. Okay. And what is the optimal thing? Well, nobody knows for sure, but if you believe in authority, John Maynard Keynes had a famous essay called "How to Pay for the War." He wrote this when Great Britain was fighting alone with the Nazi Germany. And he was basically making this point that the government has to commit significant resources to the war effort. So output is going to increase dramatically. Okay, the share of economic control for the government is going to increase dramatically. This is going to generate a lot of inflation if we do nothing. Okay, for two reasons. One is people will have more incomes, they can spend more, and we're going to have a conflict between, say, purchases of cars and purchases of tanks. This is going to create inflation because the economy is going to be so overheated. And so his suggestion was we should try to discourage private spending by basically creating very strong incentives for people to reduce their private spending. And you can do this through taxation, through borrowing, through other channels, constraining their private consumption to the extent possible. So you kind of intertemporally substitute. You tell people you don't have to buy your car today. You can buy your car in a year or 2 years, or maybe a few years after the war is going to be over. But don't buy it now, because it's going to create more inflation. It's going to create more problems for the economy. Now, so this is the general idea. If you want to avoid an overheated economy and you want to make sure you have enough resources to pay for the war, you have to reduce private spending as much as possible. Okay, that's the general idea. And you can do this through various channels. Encourage people to lend money to the government, raise taxes, have other ways to constrain, for example, just ban people from purchasing different items. This will be ways to reduce private consumption. Now, some of this was implemented during World War II. Okay, so for example, I told you that millions and millions of Americans purchased government bonds. Okay, more than a half of people purchased bonds during World War II. I don't know what is the exact number in Ukraine now, but I'm sure we have lots and lots of capacity to do this. And one way to make it happen is, for example, to raise interest rates on those bonds, because now they're way below inflation, and it's not a good investment for most people. You should also try to make it easy. You should also try to make it easy for people to buy these bonds. For example, there was a program where you have an automatic deduction to buy war bonds. Okay, so it's almost like collection of taxes, but instead of this being a tax, you have a separate account where your income is directed to purchases of bonds. So think about this as an investment account in Privatbank or Shedbank. I told you that there are other ways to incentivize people to not buy goods, and one of them was consumers in the US were not allowed to buy new cars. Okay, so this was a forced saving. If the first two bonds were about voluntary saving, this was a forced saving, which is ban people from purchases of certain items. You can also increase the tax base, and I already showed some numbers there. The number of taxpayers increased from 4 million people to 50 million people. Also, the tax rate increased dramatically. We didn't have any of this before, okay, in Ukraine. We still have a flat tax, and we don't have a big increase in the number of people paying taxes. So this is one area where we can have an improvement. As a result, only a small fraction of the war was paid with printing money, roughly 7%. In Ukraine, it's much, much higher number. It's roughly 30% of government spending is paid with the seigniorage. Okay. Now, at this stage, let me switch gears and talk about what this means for Ukraine. We have some similarities and we have some differences. The similarities are we have a limited ability to raise taxes, and we also have an enormous pressure to maintain the civilian economy. So, in some sense, it's very similar to what was happening during World War II. They raised taxes anyways. We have not done this yet, really. The differences are in the olden days during World War II, it was much harder for people to take their assets and invest them into, say, other currencies or other types of savings vehicles. So, for example, in the US, you couldn't invest in, Australian bonds or Indian bonds or anything like this. You had access only to US assets. And in Ukraine, it's much easier to do this now. You can invest in dollars, in crypto, lots and lots of things which are not directly controlled for the government. But this means that we need capital controls if we want to mobilize more resources. And the National Bank of Ukraine is doing some of this, probably needs to do a lot more. Limited ability to borrow. We know that many people have, during the war, very low savings. Many people lost their jobs. But on the other hand, we have a ton of liquidity in the banking system, 200 billion hryvnias, 300 billion hryvnias, a lot of resources. Also, because of the shadow economy, we may have low official estimates of wealth people have, but we may have a lot more that people store in their mattresses, under their mattresses, so to say. And obviously, we receive a lot more financial aid from our allies than the US could receive from anybody during World War II. So that's a big difference. One unfortunate thing, I keep talking about this, is that Ukraine relies a lot on the National Bank of Ukraine to pay for the war. This is the largest source of revenue. And that's not how it should be. We see that the second largest is the US, and new debt issuance is only the third largest. This is not sustainable. If we have a different government in the US or European Union, we're going to receive much less support, and we should be prepared that we can fill in these gaps with internal resources. And this should not be in the National Bank of Ukraine. It should come from issuing new debt or raising taxes or cutting other types of government spending. So we should be rebalancing this war financing. We cannot print this much money. It's not sustainable in the long run. Again, just to drive this point home, in Ukraine, kind of qualitatively, if you see how we finance our budget, government spending, roughly a third is coming from our allies, a third from taxes, a third from the National Bank of Ukraine, printing money. For comparison, in the US at this time, only roughly 10% was printing money, a lot was debt, and taxes, again, roughly 30 or 40%. Okay, so we need to change this composition if we want to have a sustainable war effort. We cannot print this much money. Now, what this means for the long war, how we can provide a solid economic foundation to win this war. Kind of the general idea is we need to adjust our fiscal position. We run huge fiscal deficits, and that's understandable, but how we pay for them should be rebalanced. We should not rely on printing money to pay for this. It's number one. Number two, we should avoid overheating the economy to the extent possible. So we should try to constrain private spending if we want to avoid inflation or shortages in the economy. And to this end, we have some options, again, based on the experience of World War II, World War I, or other wars. We need to raise more taxes. We have done relatively little for this. If anything, in the early days of the war, some taxes were abolished or simplified. And again, it made sense as the first response, but in the long war, it's not sustainable. We have to reduce government spending, and we already see that the government is doing this in its budget for 2023. But again, you go back to the early days of the war, the Ukrainian government was servicing its debt when it didn't have resources to do other things, including war spending, which was not a good use of scarce resources. We should destimulate private spending to the extent possible. I think the most important one is to offer people competitive interest rates so they put their savings into government debt. This is going to be good for everybody, but if it doesn't work, then we have to think about forced savings. Get more aid from the allies. In many ways, this is the cheapest resource out there. There is some variation in the numbers that Ukraine needs for the next year between 40 and 50 billion dollars. I'll go with 50 billion dollars. It is a lot of money. There is no question about this. But it is a very, very small fraction of GDP of Ukraine's allies, like 0.01%, a tiny fraction, drop in the bucket. It is only a small fraction of NATO military budget. Okay, it's only 9% of spending that governments in the EU and other countries commit to covering, compensating households for increased energy costs. So they kind of treating symptoms of this crisis. They don't give those resources to end the war. When you think about this, that it's such small fractions of GDP, military budgets, and other government programs that are out there, that Ukraine is really given an extraordinary return on the aid it receives, right? So we destroy the Russian military might. We really downgrade their military capabilities. They are much less likely to be a threat to Western Europe, Eastern Europe. And so we're doing a lot of service for global peace, so to say. And $50 billion is a small fraction of this. And again, just to put this into perspective, think about how much the US government committed to military spending during the Cold War. At its height, 70s, 80s, 10% of US GDP was committed to military spending, 10%. If we scale this to the size of the economy today, it's roughly $2 trillion. $2 trillion. So think about this, $50 billion versus $2 trillion. The orders of magnitudes are very, very different. Also, when you compare how much support Ukraine gets today relative to how much military spending was done by the US government to fight wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Ukraine is here, this dot in the right. This is how much Ukraine receives. It's a lot of money, but it's way, way, way lower than how much was spent in Afghanistan and Iraq. And those countries were a lot smaller. I don't want to say they are not important or anything like this. They are important, they are significant. But when you fight a nuclear power like Russia, as I said, we give an extraordinary return to global security for the money. Now, another thing I wanted to mention is that, there is a lot of talk about controlling prices. And this was certainly done during World War II, during the Vietnam War, during the Korean War, and many other wars in other countries. And as I told you, this was in part done to make sure that everybody has access to basic resources, basic services. Everybody could buy a loaf of bread, a glass of milk, or anything like this. This technology is so outdated now. We can have a much better sense of who needs support and make government support much, much, much more targeted, which means we do not need to regulate prices because prices are going to be creating lots and lots of distortions eventually. For example, we now know that utility bills, prices for utility are fixed, and it makes a lot of sense. It gives a lot of support, but we should also understand that it also creates huge disincentives for people to save energy. And so we have to revisit this at some point because this is not going to be sustainable in the longer run. And we already have some experience of how this worked in the past. When the government froze prices for gasoline, we have no gasoline, huge lines, huge shortages. Now prices are determined by the market. They're higher, 50%, but anybody can buy them. And this is how the economy should work because high prices, A, stimulate more supply, B, higher prices stimulate more saving, more efficiency. Okay, so this is how we should allocate resources. The final thing I want to make a point here about is we should allow the exchange rate to move. at some point. In the early days of the war, it made a lot of sense to freeze the exchange rate, fix it. It helped to contain the panic, avoid all sorts of fronts on the banking system, on the currency. But the more we have this war going on, the more mispricings and imbalances we're going to accumulate. And we should be adjusting this exchange rate at least periodically. We know it already happened in July this year, as figures from the National Bank of Ukraine, where the dashed line is the official exchange rate. But we should understand that, you know, inflation in Europe and in the US is 10%. Inflation in Ukraine is, you know, say 30%. We have 20% differential in inflation rates right there. So every year of this fixed exchange rate is going to create appreciation of the hryvnia by something like 20%. This is going to hurt our exporters. It's going to hurt our economy. It also creates all sorts of opportunities for corruption and abuse. We should not have this. We should gradually start switching to an exchange rate where market forces are determining the exchange rate, and this is going to improve the allocation of resources, and it will help the economy to adapt to the wartime challenges. Now, to conclude, you know, this is a long war already. It may, who knows how much time it's going to go on. But if you have a long war, the economy is going to be a key factor in determining who is going to be the winner, right? It's not just who has more brave troops. It's also who has more resources to produce tanks, munitions, weapons of all sorts. And for this, we need to have an economy. Ukraine has very strong allies. It's our really lifeline. But you know, imagine if something happens in Ukraine as it's is on its own, then we have to have our own very strong economy right there. And so we have to think of ways to make economy as efficient as possible. It requires extreme concentration of resources, and we are doing some of this, but probably we can do a lot more if necessary. And we have to think about ways to use resources effectively. We should not rely on price controls. We should not print money. We should start thinking about raising taxes at some point. We should use that more effectively to pay for this war. Lots and lots of things we can do to help the economy now to support the war effort, and also make sure that we avoid future macroeconomic crisis. We can certainly learn a lot from previous wars, but you know what we saw there was constrained by the available technologies at the time. So we should see what has been done and then innovate. Okay, try to come up with new solutions. You know, for example, make economic support to households much more targeted. We don't have to give money to everybody. It should be universal income. We should give it to people who really need this help. Let me stop here, and thank you again for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yuri. I don't want to take a lot of time, so I just want to remind everyone who's watching that you can post your questions, and we'll come to them in the Q&A session. Please write them in the comment section of the live broadcast. And please, Alexandra, would you add your comments and questions?
Yeah. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Yuri, for this interesting research, interesting lecture. And I would like to comment on some points that seemed particularly interesting to me, and I think for us. Let's start with the principles of wartime economy. Comparing the processes that took place during and after the Second War is really very close on my mind to our current processes. In particular, centralization and government control. However, we all remember the situation with cars, with пальне. Вибачте, забула слово. Аню, чутно мене? Пальне, забула слово англійське. oil, maybe oil, yeah. And now we have the situation with, for example, eggs. Yeah, this is some cases with parallels in black market, maybe. Yeah, and we all also remember the situation at the beginning of September, when employees of the budget sector had nothing to pay wages at all. And only when international aid arrived, we received payments. That is, the state took a maybe very careful maybe approach to printing money. And tries to contain inflation as much as possible. We see that as November 11 of November this year, the Ministry of Finance is forecasting a total annual inflation of 24, almost 25%. That is usually the general index of consumer prices, but some goods have increases in price by 2 or more times. Due to the war, the employment rate in Ukraine reached 35% according to the National Bank of Ukraine. My questions to Yuri, on your mind, what process maybe, what kind of how will be develop our employees maybe process, and maybe what about migration? What process do you maybe predict?
Yes, thank you. This are very important questions. I understand that the surveys are telling us that most people want to return to Ukraine when the war is over. And one challenge here is going to be housing stock. One big element in the reconstruction of Europe after World War II was that houses were destroyed, and it took 10-15 years for Germany, France, and other countries deeply affected by the war to rebuild their housing stock. And so for many people, it was a source of problems. You couldn't go back to work because your children didn't have a place to live or anything like this. And so one thing we should be thinking, and now with heating, it's obviously very challenging that you shouldn't necessarily go back to Ukraine if you don't have heat and electricity in your home. So one objective for post-war reconstruction is to try to accelerate rebuilding the housing stock so people can return to their homes as quickly as possible. In terms of employment, we have two things to keep in mind here. One is the supply side disruptions. For example, if you don't have electricity, it's much harder to run a business, especially when losses of electricity are unpredictable. And so one thing we need to do here, this is where the government centralization and control is critical, is to try to make our energy more robust, more resilient to Russian strikes. So if they, hit a power plant in one part of the country, it's not the end of the world. We can rely on sources of electricity from other places. And by the way, the fact that Ukraine is now connected to the European grid is extremely important. It's not just symbolic value that we're a part of Europe now. We're not connected to Russia anymore. It's also an opportunity for us to import energy from other countries. Unemployment is a big problem. You mentioned that lots of people lost their jobs. It's true, according to various estimates, the rate of unemployment somewhere between 30 and 35%. and we have to start thinking about how we can re-employ these people. This is where the experience of World War II and also the New Deal in the US is useful. If private sectors are not operating because the risks, military risks, are too high, it means the government has to step in and employ these people. So kind of public works is one natural example where you can use people, right? So say a bridge is destroyed, you need to, collect the, whatever is left and, ship away destroyed parts of the building. This may be done by various people who don't have a job in the private sector, but may be employed through public works. We already see that some of this is happening. I think the Ministry of Economy announced that the unemployed people will be basically drafted into a work army. So if you want to have some income from the government, you have to be involved in public works. We'll see how this works. And all this, the final point about shortages and prices, it's true that we'll have prices for some goods increasing a lot more than prices for other goods. With eggs, I understand 2 big chicken farms were destroyed in Ukraine. That's obviously create shortages, but we should believe in the market economy here in the sense that if the price is high, people are going to come up with solutions how to deal with this. Maybe we'll open new chicken farms, maybe new supply will come online. Maybe Ukraine is going to import more eggs from other countries. But we'll see how this is going to be resolved. But I want our government to not succumb to this urges to say, okay, the price of eggs is very high, so we have to regulate the price of eggs. This is a way to nowhere, because eventually you will end up regulating every single price, and we will have more shortages. We're not going to resolve the shortages. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, we will pay for war. Big business, for example, Akhmetov paid a record amount of taxes in advance for beginning of war, approximately 1 billion hryvnias. Private businesses and individuals fund support for the military and volunteers every day, almost every day. What do you think about the delayed demand due to this?
Yeah, so the businesses paid taxes, they moved it forward. They said tax liability at the end of the year is going to be $1 billion and $1 billion hryvnias, and so instead of paying in December, we're going to pay it in March. That's one way how we can mobilize these resources. But this intertemporal substitution, this shifting in timing, is only a partial solution. You can do this if it's a short war, but if it's a long war, it means you have to make sure that more taxes are collected from Akhmetov and from other people who have profits, who make high incomes. And I showed some numbers in my presentation that during World War II, the US collected a lot more taxes from a lot more people. The same was true for businesses. For example, there was an explicit tax on excess profits. They said, if your profit rate is more than a certain percentage, everything above that number is going to be taxed at a higher rate. So this was to make sure that there is some sense of solidarity here. That is, if you make a lot of profits from the war or during the war, you should share those profits with those who don't have resources. Okay, so there has to be more distribution.
Thank you so much. And maybe my last question, comment or questions for you. What do you think about National Council for the Recovery of Ukraine? Did you hear about it? Yeah, and now they work with 24 points in infrastructure, economy, social, ecology steps, maybe. What do you think about the main principles in their work? Maybe sustainable, or maybe principle of Industry 5.0. No, what do you think about this?
So first of all, I would say it's good that this work is being done now, because again, going back to World War II, the war in Europe was over in May 1945, but the Marshall Plan was signed into law only in 1948. I think it's April or March of 1948. So it was 3 years before the US government started to give direct aid to the European countries. It was 3 painful years, times when you didn't have a lot of resources, lots of hunger, lots of suffering. And we should learn from that mistake, and we should start to think about how we're going to do the reconstruction, who is going to pay for this, what should be the institutional arrangement for this agency, or whoever is going to do reconstruction. We should do this now, so that on the day when the war is over and we have peace again, we already have everything ready to go. Okay, so that's the first important thing. I'm glad there is a SIN National Council for the Recovery of Ukraine. I know there are other agencies and types of conversations, and which brings me to the next point about what should be the main principles. One is that it has to be owned by Ukraine, in the sense that Ukraine should feel responsible for how they spend money. For example, if we want to, if we build a bridge in, say, Bucha or Irpin, it's not because some donor wants to build a bridge there. We build that bridge because the local community needs that bridge. Eventually, aid is going to be withdrawn, and Ukraine will have to maintain a lot of projects which would be funded by potential donors. And so Ukraine has to own the same. It has to decide what is built, how it's built, and so on. Another key principle is that we should see a lot more coordination across potential donors. And it's already clear that what we see today in terms of economic aid to Ukraine is not totally effective. The US government gives us this money, the European governments give us this money. Just today, it was in the news that the European Union is going to disburse 2.5 billion euros to Ukraine, but this was the money promised in May this year. So 6 months later, they finally give us this money. That's not sustainable. This kind of delays in wartime, and the needs are particularly high. If it happens now, then you can imagine when the war is over, all those European governments will struggle to justify why they need to commit significant resources to rebuilding Ukraine. So we need a lot more coordination, a lot more commitment. We also need to understand that this reconstruction is not about rebuilding Ukraine to the way it was on the 23rd of February this year. It has to be about deep modernization of the country. Like all these destroyed buildings we see in Kharkiv and in other cities, in Mariupol, many of these buildings were constructed in the 1980s, 1970s. They are not particularly good for living. They are not very energy efficient. They don't have bomb shelters, for example. We need to deeply modernize this housing stock. It should be much more energy efficient, for example. And this is not only good for sustainability of this, it's not only good for the planet. We're going to reduce emissions, doing more energy efficient buildings, but also likely reduce our dependence on energy from Russia or from other countries. So it's also a matter of national security. So modernization is a big thing. Also, it's not just about buildings, bridges, highways. It's also about institutions, because Ukraine is going to be a part of the European Union. We have to change so many things in the way the country is run. in terms of courts, in terms of civil service, in terms of education, in terms of how resources are allocated, how we deal with monopoly power, lots and lots of things, how we regulate businesses. So a big chunk of this reconstruction should be about modernization of institutions, really upgrading institutions to a new level. And we should also use this specifically to deal with corruption issues. You know, everywhere you go, you know, in Europe and the US, people complain about corruption in Ukraine. And obviously we have corruption like any other country. And but we should also understand that we started with Yanukovych, and after that, this was really low point, and we have been gradually improving, you know, our situation with corruption. But we can do a lot more, and we can use the European Union, their institutions, as an anchor in this effort to make it a freer country, more dynamic country, more just country.
Thank you. If possible, one more small question. In your opinion, what is the biggest economic, maybe, mistake of the Ukrainian government during the war?
All right, so we should probably discuss this privately. I don't want to have it being broadcasted. I would say, you know, what kind of successes we had. We didn't have a problem with the banking system. That was great success. We still have functioning government. It's a great success. You know, when people compare Ukraine to Afghanistan and Iraq, I say it's not the right comparison, because Ukraine has a functioning government. We have democracy, right? We have the parliament running. We have the president. We have courts. We are not a failed state. We have, you know, imagine this, 20% of the country was occupied at some point. Who else would survive? You go back to World War II, the French government collapsed. They signed a, you know, peace agreement with Nazi Germany. We didn't. So there are lots and lots of things to be proud about. So I would focus on successes, not necessarily failures.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Yuri, and we appreciate you in America from Kyiv.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Yuri. And we have some questions from our audience. So if I may start, there is a question from Hanna Manoilenko. Thank you for the lecture. Do you happen to know how voluntary tax payment from private entrepreneurs in Ukraine, starting from the full-scale invasion, has affected the budget? How likely were people who have declared income in this period to actually pay taxes?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I do not have an answer, but I would say this. We can learn from other elements of this war effort. For example, we have lots and lots of platforms where people can donate their money to support the war effort. Повернись живим, Нова Ukraine, and so on. And these platforms were phenomenal in mobilizing resources, getting money from the US, from Europe, and so on. You know, they should obviously be praised and commended for this gallant efforts. Now, having said this, if we add up all the money that were collected by, all the funds that were collected by these platforms, we're probably talking about $1 billion. And that's a lot of money, and that's very significant. This support is very much appreciated. But when we think about the needs of Ukraine now during the war, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, right? So 40, 50 billions of dollars. This has to come from the government. It has to be much more organized. It can be a voluntary effort. It has to be, you know, firm commitments. The same applies to, you know, voluntary contributions to taxes to pay for the war effort. You know, it's true, some of this must be happening, but the economics of this is such that unless the government is imposing that, look, we have to have a higher tax discipline, a stronger discipline here. We have to make more people pay taxes. We have to enforce collection of taxes. Unless we have something like this, we're not going to raise significant resources. So as much as I like, voluntary support, I think it's not enough. We need to do more government intervention.
Yeah, thank you. And another question from Alex Lieberman. How can we urge the government to increase interest rates? Because their main argument is that in such way they decrease expenditures. Thank you.
Yes, so it is true. The Ministry of Finance says that we don't want to raise interest rates because eventually we're going to pay higher taxes in the future. We're going to have higher spending in the future, and so we'll have to collect more taxes in the future. It's true, but we should understand that we're going to collect those taxes and make those payments in the future when the war is going to be over and the economy is going to be stronger. So we should be intertemporally substituting here. This is what Keynes was saying in 1930s, that we should not try to make the current generation of people pay for this war expenditures. This is too much, so to say. You have all the problems from the war, plus you have to pay higher taxes. Future generations, which are going to enjoy the fruits of the peace, should be contributing to the current war effort. How do you do this? You borrow. How do you make sure people borrow? You have to have the right price. And the right price now is that the interest rate should be comparable to the rate of inflation. Again, as a point of reference, the US government paid, I think, like 3 or 4% on its war bonds, maybe 5%. It had much longer maturity, 10 years. 3 or 4% doesn't seem like a lot, but at the time, inflation was also very mild, like 3, 4, 5%. So the real return on these investments was -2%, -1%. You don't make a ton of money from this, but at least you don't lose value if you just keep dollars. Now, for us, if the rate of return on government bonds was like 10%, 12%, and the rate of inflation is 25% or 30%, for most people, it makes sense to keep their savings in dollars. Inflation in dollars is like 8%, so your rate of return is -8. It's still much more attractive than lending money to the Ukrainian government. So I don't agree with this idea that we should not raise interest rates and government debt because we're going to have more spending in the future. It's true, we will have more spending in the future, but we will be in a state where we can afford this. It's going to be less damaging for the economy. It's number one. And number two, we have to, again, use the experience of previous wars and learn from it. You shouldn't borrow for 1 year maturity. You should borrow, maturity 5 years, 10 years, longer maturity, so that people can get a decent return in the future. And this is when the payouts are going to happen, when the economy is going to do a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And may I remind that if anyone have any more questions, please post them. And I have a question which probably would be a bit naive, because I'm not an economist or financist. I'm a sociologist, and so. But I've heard a lot from our government during this war. Hot phase of the war, is that we should support Ukrainian economy, and that means also buying things and using services within Ukraine. And to my mind, it goes a bit counter to what you said, that the spending should be curtailed, should be actually limited. I do get the idea that it's better kind of not to spend, but for example, buy bonds from the government, or let government borrow your money. But I still have this contradiction, like why we are not helping our economy by spending money on it, like stimulating probably places, employments, and so on?
Yes, that's a great question. During World War II, the main issue for the US and UK was shortages of labor, that almost everybody who could work was employed. And so if you want to build a new tank, you need to find a worker somewhere. And it was very hard to find these people. We have a different situation in the sense that the rate of unemployment is not 1% or 2% or 3% like we had in the US during World War II. It's 30%. It's much higher. And so it's true that we still have a lot of capacity for private spending and government spending. However, the concern here is that the reason why private spending is unlikely to be super helpful, I think, is because the military risks are so high that it is unlikely that many businesses are going to expand to the level where we can absorb all this unemployed people. I think a much more likely scenario is that the government is going to buy something from the economy, provide types of contracts which guarantee payouts. And so the main source of increases in public demand, in aggregate demand, is going to come from the government, not from the private sector. So it's true we can spend and help the economy, but I think it's going to be only a partial solution. In the current conditions, the most of the stimulus is going to come from the government, not from private spending. This is why government needs resources, so they need to raise taxes or borrow more.
Yeah, I get that. And another question I have: could our government borrow now on internationally, or should it rely or probably press more for the aid that shouldn't be returned?
Yeah, so one reason why Ukraine cannot and should not borrow internationally is that we have issues with debt sustainability. So this year, the debt to GDP ratio is going to likely exceed 100%, which means that Ukraine probably will not be able to repay many debts in the future. And so when we have to borrow now, we should understand that there is a good chance that we will have some type of debt crisis in the future, and this is going to undermine our ability to rebuild the country. This is why, for example, grants from the US government are so valuable. They're just aid, not expected to be returned. This is the best deal Ukraine can get. Now, the European Union issues loans, and that's not the first best solution, but conditional on the fact that we have a choice: no money, or we have some borrowing from the official creditors like the European Union on very concessional terms. For example, the next year plan is that Ukraine is not going to pay anything for any interest until 2033 or something like this. So basically, for 10 years, we're not going to pay anything in terms of interest to the European governments. We should use this opportunity, but the private markets are not going to lend any money to Ukraine because they know Ukraine is not going to repay them back.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandra. Probably if you have any more questions, because it's probably all from the audience,
I would like to add one more question about real salaries of our people in now and in future, because the fall of salaries now in private sector was from 25 to 50%. We can we understand why this happened, but what do you think about next maybe how we can stop maybe or maybe more slower this process, maybe this one, because next year not very optimistic for us. It's not very optimistic for us.
Yeah, Alexander, I would say that there are two main reasons why we have a big decrease in real salaries. One is we have a lot more unemployed people. And unfortunately, there is only so much we can do here because, as I said, the current conditions are such that private businesses are unlikely to expand employment very quickly. Most of this will likely come from government contracts and the like. I'm hopeful that next year, when we have more consistent support from our allies, it will be easier to do so. We'll not have these delays that you mentioned earlier, for example. The second major source is inflation. With 30% inflation and many wages, fixed in nominal terms, pensions, budgetary sector, all these sectors have nominal salaries, right? Fixed. Obviously, the solution here is make sure that inflation is not going to be this high. So it should not be 30%. But this means we should stop printing money at the rate we are printing now, because this is very damaging for the economy.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you very much. And we are more or less within our time limits. I thank you. That was for me very enlightening and interesting, because that's not and I'm sure for many people in our audience, that's not the aspect we often talk about when we talk about the war, and often reflect about it, especially in the field of area studies, where we're much concentrated on social issues. So, and that what makes this lecture today even more important for me. So thank you very much, Yuri, for today's lecture. Thank you, Alexandra, and I thank everyone who's been watching us.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Yeah, thank you. And well, then we'll see you everyone on our next lecture with Rostislav Samkiv. Bye then.
Bye. Thank you so much, Yuri.
If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.